Imagine stepping into the streets of ancient Athens at dawn, when the sun was just beginning to rise over the marble columns that would later be celebrated as symbols of civilization. You might picture beauty, order, and philosophy echoing through the air, but what would hit you first would not be wisdom or grandeur. It would be the stench. The roads were narrow and filled with filth, the kind that clung to your sandals and turned your stomach before you could take your second breath. Waste from animals, scraps from markets, and even human refuse were tossed directly onto the streets, left to rot under the Mediterranean sun. There were no sewage systems like the Romans would later build, no running water to wash away the decay. The city that gave the world democracy and philosophy also drowned in its own stench, and for someone like you, coming from the modern world, it would feel unbearable. Subscribe now, because unlike ancient Athens, here everyone actually gets a vote, and yours is to drop a funny comment below. The noise was equally suffocating. Imagine thousands of people crowding into the agora, the public square, shouting to sell goods, debating politics, and driving donkeys loaded with amphorae full of oil or wine. Blacksmiths hammered iron with relentless force, their shops ringing with metallic clamor. Potters shouted prices for jars that chipped easily, yet were indispensable for daily life. Children screamed, goats bleated, vendors argued over fish that had already begun to smell before reaching the stalls. Silence did not exist in these streets. Even inside the home, walls were thin and houses tightly packed. Privacy was a fantasy. Every cough, every cry, every drunken quarrel spilled into your ears whether you wanted it or not. You might imagine retreating to your home for relief, but most Greek houses were modest, built of mud brick, dark and damp. Windows were small and without glass, often covered only with wooden shutters or thin cloth. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with smoke from cooking fires and oil lamps. Kitchens were primitive, smoke filled the rooms, and ventilation was poor. You would feel trapped, longing for fresh air, only to step outside and realize that fresh air in the city was almost impossible to find. The streets were often shared with stray dogs, vermin, and animals pulling carts, leaving droppings behind. In summer, the heat magnified the odor until it was almost unbearable. Disease thrived in such conditions. Fleas, lice, and rats moved freely, and the streets provided fertile ground for them. A single cut on your foot, infected by the grime, could lead to a fever that no healer could cure. Public fountains offered some relief, but the water was often stagnant or polluted by runoff from higher parts of the city. Wells might be contaminated without anyone realizing until half the neighborhood fell ill. And because there were no modern notions of hygiene, the idea of washing hands before a meal simply did not exist. You ate with fingers that had touched the same surfaces as everyone else in the marketplace, and then came the smell of the tanner's quarter. Leather workers soaked animal skins in urine and foul mixtures to soften them, creating an odor so overpowering it was said to cling to your clothes long after you left. To live in Athens or Corinth was to constantly battle with your senses, enduring noise and stench as if they were part of the very fabric of life. Even the philosophers who spoke of virtue and balance did so in streets filled with this chaos, their voices competing with the braying of donkeys and the endless din of human survival. For the poor, life was even harsher. Their homes were crammed together, often just one or two rooms shared by entire families, sometimes alongside animals. Fires for cooking spread easily, and when one house caught flame, it could take a whole block with it. There were no firefighters to call, no alarms to ring, only neighbors with buckets and panic. The wealthier citizens lived in larger homes, but even their courtyards could not keep out the clamor of the city. To imagine luxury in ancient Greece is to misunderstand what luxury meant. Comfort was relative, and what passed for refinement then would feel like suffocating poverty to you now. Festivals brought even more intensity. During the Panathenaic celebrations in Athens, thousands crowded into the streets, pressing together in a sea of bodies, chanting, cheering, and sacrificing animals whose blood flowed across the stones. The smell of roasting meat mixed with sweat, incense, and the dust kicked up by the crowd. For days, sleep was impossible, noise constant and tension high. Even joy carried with it discomfort and exhaustion. To be part of the community meant to surrender to the chaos, because resisting it was futile. And yet, for the people who lived there, this was normal. They knew no other world. But for you, used to paved streets, trash collection, running water, and quiet neighborhoods, the experience would not just be unpleasant, it would be overwhelming, crushing, and even dangerous. Your senses would rebel, your body would weaken, and your spirit would soon realize that beauty and brilliance cannot mask the filth and noise that define daily survival. It is tempting to picture the Parthenon gleaming under the sun, philosophers discussing the meaning of life, and artists carving marble into gods and heroes. But between those moments of brilliance, the streets of Greece were alive with chaos that no modern visitor could endure for long. And while you might think escaping into the countryside could bring relief, the reality outside the city walls carried its own brutal truths, ones that would test your body in ways just as unforgiving. Life in ancient Greece did not promise the long journey you might expect for yourself today. To survive past the age of 40 was not the rule, but the exception, And every year lived was marked by danger that lurked in places you might not even think about. The streets, filled with filth and noise, were already hostile, but it was inside your own body that the greatest threat waited. Without antibiotics, without vaccines, without even the faintest understanding of bacteria or viruses, the simplest wound or fever could spiral into a death sentence. A scratch from a rusted blade at the blacksmith's shop or a cut from a jagged amphora shard could fester, swelling into something that left you weak, delirious, and gone within days. Childhood was the most dangerous period of all. It is believed that as many as half of all children never reached their 5th birthday. Coughs turned to pneumonia, stomach pains to dysentery, and fevers raged without relief. Mothers carried grief as a constant companion, watching infants die from conditions we would easily treat today with a spoonful of syrup or a simple injection. Families would bury children in shallow graves close to their homes, marking the earth with stones, while the cycle of loss repeated itself across generations. Life was fragile, and every breath was uncertain. When epidemics swept through cities, they did so with merciless speed. In 430 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, Athens was struck by a plague so devastating that it killed nearly a third of its population, including the great leader Pericles. Eyewitness accounts described bodies stacked in streets, abandoned by relatives who feared infection. The air reeked of death, temples overflowed with prayers, but no god answered. People collapsed mid-conversation, stricken by sudden fevers, coughing blood and racked by convulsions. Some turned wild, drinking and indulging recklessly, convinced they would not live to see another day. The city that once boasted of its brilliance turned into a place of chaos and despair, where law, morality, and tradition broke down under the weight of unstoppable disease. Even in calmer years, the burden of illness shadowed daily life. Malaria lingered in marshy areas brought by mosquitoes that no one understood. Intestinal worms and parasites plagued children, leaving them stunted and weak. Tuberculosis, leprosy, and countless unnamed fevers passed silently from one body to another. There was no safety net, no hospital equipped with medicine, no government program to protect the vulnerable. If you were sick, you depended on the kindness of your family or on the healing hands of physicians who offered little more than guesswork wrapped in confidence. Don't just sit there nodding. Smash that subscribe button and confess in the comments what you'd complain about first, the food, the smell, or the neighbors. Those physicians, following the teachings of Hippocrates and others, believed that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When disease struck, they diagnosed an imbalance and prescribed treatments that today would seem like torture. You might be bled until you grew faint, purged with violent laxatives, or fed bitter concoctions of herbs that burned your throat but did nothing to cure the infection raging inside you. If your fever broke, the doctor was praised. If you died, your death was attributed to the will of the gods or your own failure to live a virtuous life. The very air you breathed was thought to carry poison. The Greeks spoke of miasma, a foul presence spreading sickness through smell. Swamps, rotting bodies, even unwashed clothing were seen as carriers of death. Without knowing the truth of microbes, people fought shadows, purifying temples, burning incense and cleansing altars in desperate attempts to ward off what they could not see. In their eyes, every illness was a curse, every cough a sign of divine punishment, and every plague a reminder of human fragility. Malnutrition sharpened the blade of mortality. Diets heavy on bread, olives, and wine left many without the strength to resist disease. Protein was scarce, and meat was rare outside festivals. A child already weakened by hunger stood little chance when fever came. Even adults often bore the marks of deficiency: brittle bones, bad teeth, swollen bellies from lack of proper nourishment. The body was constantly vulnerable, its defenses paper-thin, against the relentless challenges of the world. And so the people lived with death, always near. Funerals were as common as festivals, and mourning became a part of life's rhythm. Families placed coins in the mouths of the dead, payment for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, so their loved ones might cross the river Styx. Death was not an abstract fear, but a daily companion, shaping how people thought, how they prayed, and how they cherished, or sometimes squandered, their fleeting days. To imagine yourself in such a world is to confront a reality where every cough might be your last, where every cut could turn deadly, and where no amount of wealth or influence could shield you completely. Even kings and generals fell victim to unseen forces, their power meaningless against the march of disease. And if illness did not claim you, there were other chains ready to bind your fate, chains that reached beyond your health and into the very fabric of society. To live in ancient Greece was to live with a question mark hanging over your own freedom. You might have been born a citizen, proud of your city's traditions, able to stand in the assembly and listen to debates about war and law. But you might just as easily have been born into chains, a slave owned by another, your life defined not by your own will but by the desires of someone else. And even if you did hold the prized title of citizen, that did not mean your voice mattered. For most people, political power was distant, tightly controlled by wealthy landowners and men of influence. Ordinary men struggled to be heard, and women, foreigners, and slaves were silenced entirely. Slavery was woven into the fabric of Greek life, not as an exception, but as a foundation. In Athens, as much as a third of the population was enslaved. These were people captured in war, traded through markets, or even born into bondage with no hope of release. They were miners forced into the suffocating tunnels of Lorien, digging silver in darkness that blinded their eyes and broke their backs. They were household servants who cooked, cleaned, and tended children, always watched, always ordered, never free. Others worked in the fields, sweating under the relentless sun, or on ships, rowing until their hands bled. Their lives were not their own, and for them, every day was survival without dignity. But even citizens lived under restrictions that might shock you. Only men who had completed military training and whose parents were both Athenians were considered full citizens. Foreigners could live and trade in the city, but they were metics, barred from owning land or participating in politics. They paid taxes and sometimes fought in wars, but they were outsiders in the eyes of the state. And women, regardless of birth, were excluded entirely. They could not vote, could not own property independently, and could not stand in the assembly. Their role was confined to the home, their voices erased from the political life of the city. So, while the world praises Greece as the birthplace of democracy, that democracy existed only for a narrow slice of society. Consider the story of a man who was poor but technically free. He might stand in the assembly, surrounded by wealthier citizens who owned estates, slaves, and influence. He could raise his hand to vote, yes, but what did his single voice matter when orators with silver tongues and heavy purses swayed the crowd? Bribery and manipulation were common. The poor man's participation was symbolic, a reminder that while the system claimed equality in practice, power rested with those who could afford to hold it. Democracy, in its infancy, still served the elite. The cruelty of slavery extended beyond labor. Enslaved people could be punished at will, whipped, starved, or even killed without consequence. They had no legal standing, no recourse to justice, no recognition as human beings under the law. In some cases, slaves served as concubines, their bodies treated as property no different from a tool or a garment. Others were forced into dangerous public roles, such as assisting magistrates in policing, facing scorn from citizens who despised them even as they relied on their labor. To be a slave was to live in a shadow world, present everywhere but acknowledged by no one. And yet, there were moments of paradox. Some slaves, particularly those with specialized skills, scribes, accountants, artisans, could earn money, buy their freedom, and rise into limited respectability. A few even managed to live more comfortably than poor citizens. But these stories were exceptions, rare glimmers in a system built to crush rather than to elevate. For the overwhelming majority, freedom was a dream that never arrived. Even freedom itself was fragile. Imagine a war between city-states, your army defeated, and you dragged in chains to the enemy's market. In a single day, your identity could be stripped away, your name forgotten, and your future rewritten as property. To live in Greece was to live with the constant threat that everything you had, your home, your family, your dignity, could be taken from you in the chaos of war. No citizen was entirely safe, and no slave could ever hope to be. This reality shaped the culture itself. The great philosophers debated justice, freedom, and virtue while overlooking the suffering that made their discussions possible. The Parthenon's marble was raised by the labor of men who would never see their own names carved in stone. The theaters filled with citizens watching tragedies were cleaned and maintained by invisible hands that would never sit in the audience. The brilliance of Greece was built on the silence of those who had no choice but to obey. For you, accustomed to rights enshrined in law, to the idea of personal freedom and individual dignity, this world would feel suffocating. You might find yourself a citizen, proud and hopeful, only to realize that your words carried little weight. Or worse, you might wake one day in chains, sold across the sea, stripped of everything you thought was yours. And if society treated even men this way, you can only imagine how it viewed women, who bore the weight of invisibility in ways even harsher and more absolute. To be a woman in ancient Greece was to live inside a cage built of silence and obedience. From the moment a girl was born, her destiny was set not by her own will, but by the expectations of men around her. Fathers held the authority to decide her marriage, husbands controlled her daily existence, and society itself regarded her less as a person and more as property. In Athens, where democracy was praised and celebrated, women had no vote, no presence in the assembly, and no right to speak in public affairs. Their voices were confined to the walls of their homes, and even within those walls, their choices were few. Marriage was not built on love, but on strategy. A girl might be promised to a man before she was even a teenager, her future determined by alliances between families. The legal age for marriage in Athens could be as young as 12 or 13, when she was still closer to childhood than womanhood. Once married, her purpose was clear: to bear children, preferably sons, who would carry on the family line and strengthen the city-state with new warriors. A wife's worth was tied to fertility, and a woman unable to produce children could be discarded, replaced, or shamed. For her, marriage was less a partnership and more a transaction, a passage from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband. Inside the home, women's lives revolved around domestic duties. They managed the household, spun wool, baked bread, and supervised slaves if the family owned any. But even in these private spaces, their movements were restricted. Athenian houses were often divided into men's and women's quarters, and wives were expected to remain secluded, away from guests and strangers. A woman seen too often in public risked her reputation, branded as dishonorable or immoral. Respectable women kept to the shadows, their names rarely mentioned outside their families, while men conducted politics, business, and debate under the open sky. There was, however, a stark contrast when you looked at Sparta. Spartan women were granted freedoms that shocked the rest of Greece. They could own land, inherit wealth, and walk more freely in public. Girls were trained in athletics, encouraged to be strong and healthy so they could bear powerful sons. They were outspoken, sometimes even mocking Spartan men who faltered in battle. Yet even in this rare case of empowerment, their independence was tied tightly to the expectation of motherhood and their role in creating warriors for the state. Their freedom was not for their own sake, but for the strength of Sparta's armies. Elsewhere, some women carved out unusual roles. Priestesses held respected positions in temples, and certain festivals placed women at the center of rituals. At the Thesmophoria, for example, women gathered in secret to honor Demeter, goddess of fertility, performing rites from which men were strictly excluded. In these rare moments, women controlled the sacred space, whispering prayers and performing mysteries beyond male authority. But such power was fleeting, limited to the realm of religion, and dissolved once they returned to their everyday lives. For many women, invisibility was survival. To speak too loudly, to question too boldly was to risk punishment or disgrace. Adultery was punished with ruthless severity. A woman caught with another man could be cast out, stripped of her status, and even subjected to violence, while her lover faced exile or worse. Fidelity was demanded of wives, yet husbands freely kept mistresses, concubines, and slaves for pleasure without consequence. The imbalance was clear. One set of rules for men, another, far harsher, for women. Consider also the chilling reality of exposure. If a family deemed a newborn girl unwanted, too costly to raise, or less valuable than a son, the infant might be left outside the city to die from cold, hunger, or wild animals. This practice, called exposure, was not uncommon, and it revealed how fragile a woman's value was from her very first breath. Even survival into adulthood did not guarantee safety, as her life remained bound by male authority. The irony of Greek culture was sharp. This was the land that produced poets who sang of love, philosophers who spoke of justice, and artists who carved beauty into marble. Yet beneath the ideals lay the truth of women silenced, traded, and hidden away. Their stories are faint, recorded mostly through the words of men who considered them secondary beings. When women's names do appear in history, figures like Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, it is because they defied the boundaries set upon them, and their defiance was often met with suspicion, scandal, or mockery. For someone accustomed to the modern world, where the fight for equality has carved new spaces for women's voices, stepping into ancient Greece would feel suffocating. Your opinions would be dismissed, your freedom clipped, and your very presence controlled. To be born a woman was to be born into a life already written by others, a script with no chance of improvisation. And yet, even for men, daily survival carried its own burdens, because beyond the home and the hearth lay dangers far greater. Contaminated water, spoiled wine, and the constant struggle to quench thirst without poisoning yourself. If you've survived this story without fainting, hit subscribe now. And tell me in the comments if you'd last longer than a Greek hoplite. Water, the very essence of life, was one of the greatest dangers in ancient Greece. For us today, a glass of clean water is something taken for granted. But in Athens, Corinth, or any other great polis, that same glass could carry death. Wells and fountains supplied the cities, but the water often ran through channels polluted by runoff from streets, animal waste, or even the corpses of those left unburied after epidemics. Without filtration, without pipes of clay or lead properly sealed, the liquid that looked pure could be a silent assassin. Diarrhea, dysentery, and parasites spread quickly, leaving the body drained, weak, and often too frail to survive. To drink water was to gamble with your own life, and most people knew it. The solution the Greeks relied upon was wine, but this was not the fine vintage you might imagine served in crystal glasses. Their wine was thick, sometimes sour, often stored in amphorae that leaked air and spoiled the contents. To make it last, they diluted it heavily with water, creating a drink safer than plain water, but far less pleasant than what we call wine today. Guests at a symposium might sip a mixture of 1 part wine to 3 or even 5 parts water. The strength adjusted depending on whether the occasion called for sobriety or revelry. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as barbaric, a custom of foreigners, but no matter how it was mixed, the taste was sharp, sometimes bitter, often laced with resin to keep it from spoiling further. Imagine sitting at a humble meal, coarse bread, olives, maybe a bit of cheese if fortune smiled on you, and beside it, a cup of wine diluted just enough to mask the staleness of the water it contained. If you were wealthy, you might enjoy figs or honey to sweeten the drink, but for the majority, the daily reality was sour wine and questionable water. The amphorae themselves gave off their own flavors, sealed with pine pitch that left a tang harsh on the tongue. To modern taste buds, it would feel more like medicine than refreshment. Even this solution carried dangers. Amphorae stored too long in the sun or kept in damp cellars could produce wine laced with toxins, making drinkers sick. The Greeks had no knowledge of fermentation gone wrong, no understanding of bacteria or mold. They drank what was available, hoping their bodies could endure it. And because children were not spared from this reality, they too drank diluted wine from an early age, their stomachs forced to adapt to what their society offered. There was no concept of childhood innocence in diet. Survival demanded adaptation from the very beginning. In cities like Athens, public fountains became gathering places, but they also became sources of risk. Crowds of people and animals pressed around them daily, each drawing from the same basin, each dipping hands and containers into the same water. If one person carried disease, the fountain became an instrument of contagion, yet people had no choice. A woman fetching water for her family knew she risked carrying illness home in every jug she lifted to her shoulder. The irony was cruel. The act of sustaining life often sowed the seeds of death. Even wine, the so-called safeguard, was not a shield against the harshness of life. It dulled pain, yes, but it also clouded judgment, and drunkenness was common in both the wealthy and the poor. Symposia, those elegant drinking parties where men debated philosophy and recited poetry, often dissolved into chaos, fights, and debauchery. For common laborers, wine was a crutch after long hours of toil, a way to forget hunger or exhaustion, but also a chain that dragged them deeper into weakness. The very drink that was supposed to protect them became another burden on already fragile bodies. Some communities tried to outwit the dangers with rituals and prayers. Before drinking, libations were poured to the gods, small offerings to Dionysus or other deities who might purify what the people could not. In their eyes, health was tied not to microbes or toxins, but to divine favor, and so every cup raised was both nourishment and plea. Yet no amount of prayer could cleanse the water of parasites or cure the sickness that followed. The gods remained silent as countless lives ended in thirst and contamination. What might surprise you is how deeply this shaped Greek culture. The reliance on wine gave rise to the art of winemaking, to the rituals of feasts, to the myths that surrounded Dionysus as the god of wine and ecstasy. Drinking was not just necessity, but identity, a bond between survival and celebration. But beneath the laughter and the clinking of cups lay the constant reminder that this practice existed because nature itself had turned hostile. Every drink was a compromise between risk and necessity, between the sweetness of life and the bitterness of decay. For you, accustomed to turning on a tap and trusting what flows out, this reality would be unbearable. To wake each day knowing that your thirst could kill you, to hand your child a cup that might carry disease, to live in a world where even celebration was tainted by fear, it would gnaw at your spirit. And if water and wine tested the body, there were threats just as merciless waiting beyond the city walls where armies marched, alliances shifted, and war could arrive at your doorstep without warning. War in ancient Greece was not a distant possibility. It was a constant shadow that could fall over your life at any moment. To live in Athens, Sparta, or any of the countless city-states scattered across the Aegean meant knowing that conflict was never far away. Alliances shifted with dizzying speed. Enemies today might be allies tomorrow, and the sound of marching soldiers could echo through the valleys without warning. For modern eyes, the grandeur of Greek temples and the brilliance of their philosophy often blinds us to the brutal truth. The very soil of Greece was soaked in blood, and survival often depended on luck rather than strength. Imagine waking to the call of horns echoing down narrow streets, the frantic cries of neighbors as rumors spread that enemy hoplites had crossed the border. Panic would ripple like fire through the city, women rushing to gather children, elders clutching what little they could carry, while men scrambled to find shields and spears that had rusted in corners from the last campaign. There was no standing professional army in most cities. Common citizens became soldiers when war arrived. Farmers, potters, and fishermen were thrust into ranks, their bodies untrained for the horrors that awaited. For them, war was not glory, it was obligation, and the cost was often their lives. The Peloponnesian War, a brutal conflict between Athens and Sparta, dragged on for nearly 3 decades, swallowing entire generations. One season might bring victory, the next devastating defeat. Cities were burned, fields stripped bare, and populations starved. Refugees poured into Athens, cramming the city beyond capacity, where overcrowding bred plague that killed thousands more than the enemy ever could. The war left scars, not only on the land, but on the soul of Greece itself, breaking trust, sowing bitterness, and turning neighbor against neighbor. The brutality of combat was unlike the staged images you might picture from art or cinema. Hoplite warfare was close, suffocating, and merciless. Men stood shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx formation, shields locked, spears thrust forward. When the lines clashed, it was not a graceful dance, but a crushing wall of flesh, wood, and iron. Soldiers were trampled, skewered, suffocated beneath piles of bodies. Blood soaked the earth, screams filled the air, and survival depended less on skill than on endurance and sheer luck. For the man in the middle ranks, the only view was the back of the comrade in front of him and the overwhelming press of bodies that threatened to suffocate him before the enemy's spear did. And when the battle was done, the suffering continued. Defeated soldiers could be sold into slavery, their cities razed, their families scattered. Women and children became spoils of war, taken as property by the victors. In some cases, entire male populations were executed to prevent rebellion, as happened in Melos when Athens destroyed the city and slaughtered its men. War was not just about territory. It was about domination, about ensuring that the enemy could never rise again. The cruelty was systematic, accepted as part of the rhythm of survival. Sieges were among the most terrifying experiences. Imagine your city surrounded, supplies cut off, every road watched by enemy scouts. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. As food dwindled and desperation set in, bread became a luxury, water rationed, disease spread in the cramped quarters of starving citizens. Hope flickered only when reinforcements might come, but too often they never did. The enemy could wait you out, and when the gates finally fell, the slaughter was total. A city that had stood for centuries could vanish in a single campaign, its name reduced to a warning whispered in other streets. Naval battles added another layer of terror. The triremes of Athens, sleek warships with 3 rows of oars, sped across the Aegean with deadly precision. Rams of bronze tore into wooden hulls, splintering ships and throwing men into the sea. Drowning became as common as death by blade, as men flailed in waters stained with pitch and blood. To be a sailor was to face death not only from the enemy, but from the sea itself, an element as unpredictable and merciless as war. Even those who survived the battlefield carried scars that never healed. Bones shattered, wounds infected, eyes lost to arrows or stones hurled from slings. There were no prosthetics, no reconstructive surgeries, only disfigurement and pain. Veterans often returned broken in body and spirit, unable to farm, unable to fight, living reminders of the cost of glory. And yet, society celebrated warriors, erecting monuments to victories while leaving countless nameless soldiers forgotten in unmarked graves. The constant threat of war also shaped daily life. Boys were raised with the knowledge that they would one day hold a spear, drilled in discipline and endurance, their games a preparation for battle. In Sparta, this training was even harsher. Boys torn from their families at 7 years old to live in barracks, whipped into submission, hardened into soldiers who belonged not to themselves, but to the state. Childhood was short, innocence even shorter, because the city demanded warriors before it allowed men. For modern people, the sheer unpredictability of it all would be unbearable. To plant a field knowing it could be burned tomorrow, to raise children knowing they could be taken in conquest, to build a home knowing it might be torn down stone by stone. There was no peace you could trust, no safety you could guarantee. War was not an event on the horizon. It was a drumbeat that never stopped, pulsing beneath the surface of every conversation, every decision, every fragile moment of calm. And if war crushed the body and soul, the justice that followed could be just as cruel. For the laws of ancient Greece were sharp, swift, and often merciless, a system that cared little for mercy when order was threatened. Justice in ancient Greece was not the blind and balanced figure that modern societies imagine. It was sharp, unpredictable, and often brutally unfair, a weapon wielded by the powerful to protect their own interests. For someone stepping into that world, the court system would feel more like a public spectacle than a pursuit of truth. Ordinary citizens feared the law as much as they feared enemies in war, because punishment came swiftly and mercy was rare. To live under such a system meant that every misstep, every accusation, even every whisper against you could end with humiliation, pain, or death. Trials in Athens, the so-called cradle of democracy, were less about careful investigation and more about persuasion. Juries were enormous, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, and they were ordinary citizens, chosen at random. There were no professional judges as we know them today, no lawyers to represent you. You stood alone before the crowd, forced to speak for yourself, your fate hanging on your ability to sway emotions rather than present evidence. A rich man might hire a speechwriter to craft words dripping with rhetoric, but a poor farmer with a trembling voice often stood no chance. Justice was less about facts and more about performance, a theater where your life was the script and the jury the audience. The punishments themselves were harsh and often final. Theft could result in fines so high they ruined families, or in flogging that left scars for life. Repeat offenders could be executed without hesitation. Adultery was not simply a private matter, but a crime against the household and society itself. A man caught with another man's wife could be killed on the spot, his blood staining the very bed where he was discovered. Women, already silenced in public life, bore punishments that stripped them of what little dignity they had left. Banished from their homes, marked with shame, they lived out the rest of their days as shadows among the living. And then there were the cases of impiety, the failure to respect the gods, to mock a ritual, to question the sacred, to corrupt youth with dangerous ideas. All these were crimes that shook society to its core. The most famous example remains Socrates, condemned to death in 399 BCE for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. He was forced to drink a cup of hemlock, his calm acceptance forever etched into history. Yet behind the noble story lay a grim truth. The courts were tools of fear, ensuring that no one strayed too far from the norms that held the fragile city together. Public humiliation was also a weapon. Accused men could be stripped of their citizenship, forbidden to speak in the assembly or serve in the army. They became non-persons, alive but invisible, a punishment that cut deeper than exile. In a society where honor was everything, to lose your reputation was to lose your very existence. And this dishonor extended to your family, staining the lives of your children and grandchildren. Justice did not simply punish the guilty, it poisoned bloodlines. Slaves, of course, had no voice at all. Their testimony in court was considered unreliable unless it was extracted under torture. Imagine being beaten, burned, or broken until you said what your master wanted, your words twisted into truth by the lash. For them, justice was not even a cruel parody. It was an absence, a void where rights should have been. Their suffering was invisible, their lives expendable, their silence the foundation upon which the laws of citizens rested. Exile was another common punishment, and though it might sound merciful compared to death, it was a living death of another kind. To be cast out of your city meant losing your home, your community, your gods, your very identity. Greeks were deeply tied to their polis, and to live outside it was to be rootless, a wanderer in hostile lands. Aristides the Just, admired for his fairness, was once exiled simply because people grew tired of hearing him praised. Justice could be twisted not only by guilt, but by jealousy, pettiness, and the shifting winds of public opinion. Even the process of law carried its own dangers. Litigants often relied on slaves or family members to deliver testimony, dragging entire households into the chaos of accusations. Neighbors and friends could be forced to choose sides, dividing communities with bitterness that lingered for years. For those too poor to pay fines or defend themselves, debt bondage became a trap, reducing free men to near slavery. To stand before the court was not just a personal ordeal, it was a spectacle that consumed everyone around you. What makes this all the more haunting is how normalized it was. The Greeks believed their system was a triumph of civilization, superior to monarchies or tyrannies. They saw the participation of ordinary men in judgment as a form of equality. And yet, beneath this ideal, fear pulsed through every case, every sentence, every punishment. The law was not a shield for the weak, it was a hammer, and those beneath it were crushed without pity. To live in such a society would be to live under constant tension. You could lose everything for a careless word, a failed argument, or the envy of a rival. Your freedom, your reputation, your very life could be voted away by hundreds of strangers, swayed by passion, prejudice, or greed. Justice was not your protector. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice played in front of the entire city. And when the verdict was read and punishment carried out, you were left to wonder if survival was worth the cost, especially when even daily bread and sustenance were fragile, scarce, and never guaranteed. Food in ancient Greece was not a feast of abundance, but a daily battle against scarcity. The land itself, rocky and uneven, was never meant to sustain large populations easily. Fields clung to hillsides, thin soil baked under the sun, and harvests depended heavily on the whims of weather. A poor season could mean hunger for thousands, while even in good years, diets were repetitive and meager. For someone like you, accustomed to supermarkets overflowing with choices, the reality of Greek tables would feel shockingly bare, defined more by survival than pleasure. The staple of life was bread, made from barley rather than wheat, because barley grew more reliably in the stubborn soil. It was coarse, dark, and heavy, filling the stomach but hard on the teeth. To soften it, people often soaked it in water or wine, turning it into a mush rather than the warm, fluffy loaves you might imagine. A meal without bread was rare, and yet bread alone could not provide enough strength for bodies worn down by constant labor. Alongside it came olives, salty and oily, eaten whole or pressed into the liquid gold that flavored nearly every dish. Olive oil was not just food, but fuel for lamps, trade currency, and a symbol of wealth, though for the poor it was used sparingly, stretched as far as possible. Wine diluted with water accompanied nearly every meal, not as luxury but as necessity. Its sour taste masked the impurities of water and gave even the simplest food some sense of satisfaction. Cheese from goats or sheep occasionally appeared, sharp and pungent, while fish was common in coastal cities, though fresh fish was often too costly for the poor. More often they ate small salted fish or sardines, packed tightly into jars and carried inland. Meat, however, was a rarity. Ordinary families might eat it only during festivals or sacrifices. when animals were slaughtered for the gods and portions of roasted flesh were shared among the people. To sit at a table with roasted lamb or beef was not an everyday event. It was a moment of celebration, a reminder of the divine woven into the act of eating. For the very poor, meals were little more than gruel, a thin porridge of barley mixed with onions, lentils, or whatever scraps could be found. Garlic was a favorite seasoning, cheap and strong enough to disguise the blandness of the food. Honey was the primary sweetener, but it was precious, gathered from wild hives or kept by those wealthy enough to maintain bees. Fruits like figs and grapes provided natural sugars, but they were seasonal and could not always be counted on. In winter, diets shrank and hunger pressed harder. To wake with an empty stomach and know there was no guarantee of food by nightfall was a reality far too common. The gap between rich and poor was stark. Wealthy households could afford wheat bread, imported spices, and delicacies like peacocks, pheasants, or exotic fruits from distant lands. Their banquets were displays of power, designed to impress guests with variety and excess. But these meals were rarefied spectacles, far removed from the daily grind of ordinary citizens. For the majority, food was not pleasure but survival, a monotonous cycle of bread, olives, and diluted wine. The flavors that filled poetry and myth were luxuries most never tasted. What made the struggle harsher was the fragility of agriculture itself. Without advanced irrigation, farmers prayed for rains that often came too little or too much. A drought could ruin crops, while sudden storms could flatten fields. Locusts, pests, and diseases struck without warning, leaving families desperate. Grain shortages could send prices soaring, pushing the poor to the edge of starvation. The memory of famine haunted Greek society, shaping rituals, prayers, and sacrifices meant to appease Demeter, goddess of the harvest, whose favor was believed to determine whether bellies were full or empty. In times of scarcity, communities turned to imports, bringing grain from Egypt or Sicily by ship, but this dependence on trade carried its own risks. A naval blockade during war, or a storm that sank merchant ships, could cut off supplies entirely. Athens, with its great population, was especially vulnerable, and securing grain became a matter of survival, influencing politics, alliances, and even military campaigns. Bread was more than food. It was power, the line between stability and collapse. This fragile balance of sustenance bled into cultural identity. The Greeks saw themselves as distinct from barbarians because of their diet. To them, eating bread and olive oil was civilized, while others who relied on milk or raw meat were viewed as less refined. Yet beneath this pride lay the hard truth that their own diet was meager, their pride born not of abundance, but of necessity. It was easier to celebrate what little you had than to admit how often you went without. Imagine yourself at their table. No sugar, no chocolate, no coffee, no spices to liven the tongue. Just bread, olives, a smear of cheese, perhaps a handful of dried figs if fortune smiled. The monotony would weigh on you as much as the hunger, day after day, season after season. And when the harvest failed or war cut off trade, you would feel your strength slipping, your body weakening, your hope dimming with every empty plate. To survive on such food was to carry constant anxiety, to measure life by the size of the harvest, to taste fear in every bite. And yet, for many Greeks, life was not spent in fertile valleys, but in the countryside, where the backbreaking labor of farming under an unforgiving sun became a prison of its own, demanding sweat and sacrifice that left little room for rest. Life in the Greek countryside was a relentless struggle, measured not in days of leisure, but in the endless rhythm of toil under a burning sun. Most people were not philosophers debating in the agora or generals commanding fleets. They were farmers, bound to the soil that both gave life and threatened to take it away. To imagine yourself in their sandals is to imagine waking before dawn, when the air was still cool, dragging yourself into rocky fields with tools made of wood and bronze, your body already aching before the work had begun. The Greek landscape, though beautiful in poetry, was harsh in reality. Hills and mountains carved the land into fragments, leaving little flat terrain for planting. Fields were often patches of earth cleared of stones by hand, planted with barley, olives, or vines that clung stubbornly to the soil. The harvests were uncertain, every year a gamble. Too little rain meant crops shriveled, too much rain meant they rotted in place. The farmer's entire existence balanced on forces beyond his control, with no safety net when nature turned cruel. Droughts brought despair, floods washed away labor, and winds could strip vineyards bare overnight. Every task was done with muscle and sweat. Plows were pulled by oxen if you were lucky enough to own them. If not, you pushed and dug yourself. Sowing seeds was done by hand, bent over for hours until your back felt broken. Harvest meant cutting stalks with sickles, binding them in sheaves, carrying them across fields while the sun scorched your skin. There was no respite, no weekends, no concept of rest. Farming was not just work, it was survival, and failure meant hunger not only for you, but for your entire family. Women and children were drawn into this cycle too. While men labored in the fields, women managed the grinding of grain into flour, the weaving of cloth, the tending of gardens, and the care of animals. Children herded goats, fetched water from distant wells, or helped gather olives during the harvest. Childhood was brief. By the time you could walk steadily, you were expected to contribute. There was no escape from labor, no separation between work and life, because they were one and the same. Food and security was a constant companion. In lean years, families stretched rations as far as possible, eating barley gruel flavored with little more than garlic or onions. Malnutrition weakened bodies already strained by labor, making them more vulnerable to disease. Starvation was not an abstract fear, but a lived memory, etched into the stories passed down from generation to generation. To sit at a table and know there was not enough to fill every stomach was a weight that pressed on families each winter, gnawing at hope as much as at the body. The seasons ruled the lives of farmers with iron authority, planting in autumn, tending in spring, harvesting in summer, storing in winter. Every moment was dictated by cycles of earth and sky. Festivals and rituals often revolved around these agricultural rhythms. Offerings were made to Demeter and other gods to bless the crops, sacrifices of animals performed in the hope of favorable weather. Religion and farming were inseparable, because when your life depended on rain and soil, it was easier to believe in the will of the divine than in chance. And when crops failed despite prayers, despair cut deeper, a wound both physical and spiritual. Even success was fleeting. If the harvest was good, much of it went to taxes or rent owed to wealthier landowners. Small farmers often found themselves trapped in debt, their produce claimed by others before their families could taste it. Some lost their land entirely, reduced to working fields they no longer owned, little better than slaves in their own homes. Freedom meant little when hunger bound you tighter than any chain. The illusion of independence was shattered by the cruel math of survival, where a single bad year could erase generations of labor. Yet, despite this hardship, the countryside was not quiet. Raids and wars reached even the most remote villages, burning fields and scattering families. Soldiers marching to battle often trampled crops underfoot, while enemy armies pillaged supplies, leaving devastation in their wake. A farmer could spend months tending a field, only to watch it consumed in flames in a single night. In such moments, the fragility of rural life became unbearable, and the thin line between survival and ruin snapped without warning. The physical toll was immense. Backs hunched from endless bending, hands blistered and scarred, faces burned by sun and wind. There were no doctors to heal strained muscles or broken bones, only crude remedies of herbs and rest that could not restore strength. Farmers lived with pain as naturally as they lived with hunger, their bodies marked by their labor until death finally offered release. To look upon them was to see resilience carved into flesh, endurance painted across weary faces. For modern eyes, accustomed to machines plowing fields, refrigerated storage, and grocery stores brimming with food year-round, the Greek countryside would feel like a punishment. Each day was a wager against forces you could not control, each year a question of whether you would endure or fall. And yet, the countryside was not the only danger waiting for the unsuspecting. Beyond the fields stretched the sea, a highway of trade and travel, but also a graveyard of ships and sailors where storms and pirates turned the promise of opportunity into the certainty of peril. The sea was the heartbeat of ancient Greece, both a giver of life and a taker of it. With mountains cutting the land into fragments, the Greeks turned naturally to the water for trade, travel, and survival. To look out across the Aegean, shimmering under the sun, was to see both promise and peril stretching into the horizon. For every ship that returned laden with grain, wine, or exotic goods, another was lost to storms, rocks, or the blades of pirates. The Mediterranean was not a calm, blue cradle of civilization. It was a restless, unpredictable force that swallowed men and cities alike. For the common sailor, life aboard a trireme or merchant vessel was brutal. These ships were slender, built for speed, with decks crowded and supplies sparse. Rowers bent over oars for hours on end, backs burning, hands blistered, sweat pouring down their bodies. The air below deck was suffocating, thick with the smell of unwashed men and stagnant water. There was no comfort, no privacy, no relief except the brief moments when the ship anchored near shore. Food was basic: barley bread, salted fish, and a little wine to keep the thirst at bay. Sleep was stolen in snatches, bodies curled on hard planks, rocked endlessly by the sea. Storms were the great terror. Without compasses or modern navigation, sailors relied on stars, landmarks, and sheer luck. A sudden change in wind could turn calm waters into a fury of waves, tossing ships like toys. Lightning split the sky, thunder roared, and men prayed desperately to Poseidon, god of the sea, begging him to spare their fragile vessel. Many were not spared. Ships splintered against rocks, men thrown into the churning water, their cries lost in the roar. To drown at sea was one of the most feared deaths, for it meant no proper burial, no passage to the underworld, only a restless spirit wandering forever in the deep. Even when the weather was kind, danger prowled in other forms. Pirates infested the waters, swift ships striking from hidden coves. They came not just for cargo, but for people, seizing sailors and passengers to sell in distant slave markets. A single voyage could end with chains on your wrists and your life auctioned to the highest bidder. The sea was a gamble, and every man who stepped aboard knew he risked not only death but enslavement. Trade was essential, yet it was carried out under constant threat, as fragile as the wooden hulls that carried it. The importance of maritime routes made naval power a measure of survival. Athens built its empire on the strength of its fleet, triremes slicing across the waves like blades. These warships were manned by citizens who owed their city not just taxes, but their sweat and blood at the oars. Battles at sea were chaotic, bronze rams smashing into enemy hulls, splinters flying, men hurled overboard. Victory was exhilarating, but defeat was catastrophic, leaving survivors clinging to wreckage, praying for rescue that often never came. The sea demanded as much courage as any battlefield on land, and it claimed lives with equal cruelty. Even peaceful journeys carried risks that gnawed at the mind. A voyage from Athens to Sicily might take weeks, with every day bringing uncertainty. Food could spoil, water could run low, and sickness spread quickly in the cramped conditions of a ship. A simple infection could cripple an entire crew, leaving them adrift and helpless. When storms delayed arrivals, families waited anxiously on the shore, scanning the horizon for sails that never appeared. Hope turned to mourning, and mourning became another reminder that the sea answered to no man. Yet despite its dangers, the sea was irresistible. It brought wealth through trade, carrying pottery, olive oil, and wine to foreign markets while returning with grain, metals, and luxury goods. It connected cultures, spreading ideas, art, and beliefs across vast distances. It shaped Greek identity itself, making them a people of the sea as much as of the land. But every gift came with a price, and the Greeks paid that price in lives lost, ships sunk, and countless bodies swallowed by waves. Religious rituals reflected this fear and dependence. Before voyages, captains poured libations to Poseidon, casting wine into the water as offerings. Sacrifices were made, prayers whispered, and temples erected along coasts to honor the gods of the sea. Mariners carried amulets for protection, believing divine favor was their only shield against the ocean's wrath. And still, when storms struck, when pirates attacked, when hulls cracked under strain, those prayers often went unanswered, reminding everyone that the gods were as capricious as the sea itself. For someone used to airplanes and ferries, where travel feels routine and safe, the reality of Greek seafaring would be overwhelming. Every journey was a test of fate, every departure a possible farewell. You could leave your home expecting to return in weeks, only to vanish into the silence of the deep. Your name whispered in morning songs, but your body never recovered. The sea gave life, yes, but it also demanded sacrifice, and no one who set sail could ever escape its looming shadow. And yet, if the sea tested the courage of men, the land itself offered a spectacle just as cruel. For in the heart of Greek cities, death and suffering became not tragedies to be hidden, but entertainments to be shared, where violence turned into theater and the pain of others was transformed into public amusement. In the bustling heart of ancient Greek cities, entertainment was not the polished spectacle of theater or poetry alone. It often leaned into cruelty, feeding on the suffering of others in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Violence was not something to be hidden behind closed doors. It was brought out into the open, staged in front of crowds, and turned into an event. For the Greeks, the pain of another human being could be a lesson, a warning, or simply a diversion from the monotony of survival. To witness suffering was, for many, to feel part of the communal life of the city, even if that meant standing shoulder to shoulder in a throng that roared at scenes of humiliation and blood. Public punishment was one of the most common forms of spectacle. When someone broke the law, their trial might have been held in the assembly or before a large jury, but the sentence was often carried out before a crowd. Flogging, mutilation, and even executions were performed where anyone could watch. The lash cracking against flesh was as much a sound of order as it was of pain, reminding onlookers of the cost of defiance. For citizens, it reinforced the fragile sense of security. For slaves and outsiders, it was a message of dominance. No one was immune from the theater of punishment, and shame was a tool as sharp as the whip itself. Slaves in particular often bore the brunt of public cruelty. Because their testimony was only considered valid when given under torture, their bodies became instruments of legal drama. Crowds knew this, and they watched as confessions were beaten or burned out of them. To modernize, this would be unthinkable, but for the Greeks, it was woven into the concept of justice. It was a grim reminder that freedom was fragile, and that to be voiceless meant to have your pain turned into proof. The spectacle of torture blurred the line between law and entertainment, with onlookers murmuring judgments as if watching a play. Even religious rituals contained elements of blood and suffering. Sacrifices of animals were public, with oxen, goats, or sheep slaughtered in front of large gatherings. The blood poured out onto altars, the smell of roasting meat filling the air, while priests performed chants and prayers. For the crowd, this was not horror. It was celebration, a necessary transaction with the gods. Yet to stand among them, to hear the cries of the animals and smell the iron tang of blood, would be to realize that the sacred was built upon scenes of violence dressed as devotion. The gods demanded spectacle, and the people provided it. The theater itself, the pride of Greek culture, was no stranger to brutality. While tragedies elevated the pain of myth into art, their performances were also communal exercises in watching suffering unfold. Audiences wept as Oedipus blinded himself, as Medea murdered her children, as warriors fell in battle. These stories reflected the cruelty of life itself, and the crowds leaned into that cruelty, purging emotions in what Aristotle later called catharsis. To sit in a Greek theater was to witness suffering elevated into something almost divine, a reminder that agony was not just lived, but shared, dissected, and applauded. But alongside symbolic pain came real contests that pushed bodies to breaking points. Athletic games like those held in Olympia were celebrated as tests of human strength, yet they often carried deadly risks. Boxers fought without gloves, their fists wrapped in leather straps that tore flesh and broke bones. Pancration, a brutal blend of wrestling and striking, allowed almost anything short of biting and eye gouging. Fighters emerged battered, bloodied, and sometimes lifeless, while the crowd cheered. Victory was glory, defeat was humiliation, and the line between sport and violence was razor thin. For spectators, these contests thrilled as much for the risk of death as for the display of skill. Public executions, though less frequent than in later societies, were moments of collective spectacle. Whether through stoning, poison, or forced suicide, the city watched its condemned fall. The death of Socrates is remembered for its dignity, but countless others died less nobly, their ends marked by the jeers or silence of the crowd. For the Greeks, the execution of justice was part of civic life, a way to remind everyone that order depended on the willingness to spill blood when necessary. Each death reinforced the fragile balance that held society together. Even festivals of joy could turn cruel. Drunken revelries dedicated to Dionysus sometimes spiraled into violence as intoxicated mobs clashed in the streets. Ritual frenzy blurred into chaos, and the line between celebration and brutality dissolved. A festival could end not with laughter, but with bruises, blood, and broken bones. For those swept up in the madness, it was proof of divine possession. For those watching, it was yet another form of spectacle, half terrifying, half mesmerizing. It is easy to forget that, for the Greeks, cruelty was not just tolerated, but normalized. To see suffering was to see justice, to see devotion, to see competition, even to see art. For someone used to the sanitized punishments of courts or the controlled violence of modern sports, the openness of it all would feel like stepping into a nightmare. Pain was not hidden. It was displayed, dissected, and consumed. And yet, what made it worse was that these public entertainments were not isolated moments. They were woven into daily life, reminders that cruelty was part of existence, that survival came not only through strength, but through acceptance of the suffering of others. And if witnessing violence was unsettling, living under the weight of constant fear of divine wrath was even more suffocating. For in Greece, the gods themselves were never far away, and their unpredictable demands pressed down on every breath you took. Religion in ancient Greece was not a gentle comfort. It was a weight that pressed on every decision, every breath, every step you took. The gods were everywhere, their moods unpredictable, their punishments swift, and their favor uncertain. To live in Greece meant waking each morning, not only to face hunger, war, or disease, but also to wonder if you had unknowingly offended Zeus, angered Poseidon, or failed to honor Demeter. The line between survival and destruction often felt as thin as the smoke rising from a sacrifice. For you, stepping into that world, the sense of constant spiritual pressure would be suffocating, leaving you anxious that even your thoughts might provoke divine wrath. Temples dominated the skyline of cities, not just as symbols of devotion, but as reminders of divine power. The Parthenon in Athens, gleaming with marble, was not simply an architectural masterpiece, but a constant declaration that the gods watched and judged. Every public gathering, from political assemblies to athletic contests, was tied to rituals meant to appease divine beings. The Olympic Games themselves were not just competitions of strength, but offerings to Zeus, with sacrifices and prayers as central as the races and the matches. Religion was not separate from daily life. It was daily life, woven so tightly into existence that ignoring it was unthinkable. Sacrifice was the heart of worship. Animals, from goats and sheep to massive oxen, were led to altars where their throats were cut, blood spilling across sacred stones. The smoke of burning flesh rose toward the sky, carrying with it the prayers of the people. For the crowd, this was not gruesome but essential, a transaction with the divine. The gods demanded sustenance, and humanity provided it, hoping in return for fertile crops, victory in battle, or safety at sea. Imagine standing in a crowd as priests chanted, the smell of roasted meat mixing with incense and sweat, and realizing that your city's survival depended on this bloody ritual. For the Greeks, it was not barbarity, it was necessity. But the gods were not merciful overseers. They were fickle, jealous, and often cruel. Myths told of Hera's wrath against women who caught Zeus's eye, of Poseidon's tempests unleashed upon sailors, of Artemis striking down those who dishonored her sanctuaries. These stories were not just tales, they were warnings. To anger a god, even by accident, could bring plague, famine, or destruction upon your entire community. A failed harvest might be explained as Demeter's displeasure, an earthquake as Poseidon's vengeance, a sudden illness as Apollo's arrow. Fear of divine punishment was a constant hum beneath every ritual, every prayer, every festival. Superstition filled the gaps where ritual could not reach. Omens in the flight of birds, the crack of thunder, or the patterns in animal entrails guided decisions from warfare to marriage. Leaders sought oracles before embarking on campaigns, their words ambiguous, open to dangerous misinterpretation. The Oracle of Delphi, sitting in a trance, muttering riddles through the fumes of burning laurel, held power over kings and generals alike. But her pronouncements were never clear, forcing men to gamble lives and nations on cryptic phrases. Victory and disaster often hinged on a single misunderstood word, reminding everyone that fate was fragile, and the gods never truly predictable. Even in private life, the weight of religion was overwhelming. Households kept small shrines, pouring libations of wine or oil to household deities, praying before meals, before travel, before sleep. Children were taught early to honor the gods, to never let rituals slip, to fear neglect as much as open rebellion. A broken vow or forgotten offering could be seen as the cause of misfortune, and guilt haunted families as much as hunger or poverty. Imagine living each day with the conviction that every hardship you suffered might be your own fault for not honoring the divine properly. Religious festivals, while joyous on the surface, carried this same undertone of obligation. The Dionysia in Athens brought parades, plays, and wine-fueled revelry, yet behind the laughter lay the solemn duty of honoring Dionysus, whose favor ensured fertility and prosperity. The Eleusinian mysteries promised participants secret knowledge of the afterlife, but the ceremonies were cloaked in fear, with threats of death to anyone who revealed what they saw. Religion was both celebration and intimidation, offering glimpses of hope while binding lives with chains of ritual and fear. The afterlife itself was not a comforting vision. For most, the journey after death was bleak, a shadowy existence in the underworld. The dead crossed the river Styx only if their families buried them properly and placed coins in their mouths as payment for Charon, the ferryman. Without these rites, souls were doomed to wander restlessly, denied peace. Even in death, the fear of neglect lingered, and families lived under pressure to honor their dead correctly, lest the spirits return in anger. Death was not an escape from divine judgment, it was a continuation of it. For the Greeks, religion was not faith in the modern sense. It was obligation, fear, and constant negotiation. Every feast, every sacrifice, every prayer was part of a fragile bargain, with forces too powerful and too volatile to trust. It shaped politics, dictated law, and intruded into the most intimate corners of family life. To live outside its rituals was to live in defiance, and defiance brought ruin. The gods were not distant. They were intrusive, unpredictable, and often merciless. For someone used to freedom of belief, or even the ability to ignore religion entirely, ancient Greece would feel suffocating. Every misfortune would be read as divine punishment, every decision filtered through omens and priests. You would find yourself trapped in a world where even your silence could be seen as disrespect, where the gods were not sources of comfort but threats looming over every breath. And if the weight of the divine did not already crush your spirit, the reality of human cruelty would finish the task. For life in ancient Greece was not only governed by fear of gods, but by the mercilessness of men who controlled society's every fragile thread. To walk the streets of ancient Greece was to carry a constant awareness that cruelty was not an accident of life, but an expectation, woven into the very fabric of society. The gods demanded sacrifice, rulers demanded obedience, and ordinary people often demanded blood as a form of entertainment or justice. This acceptance of suffering as part of existence hardened the culture in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Compassion existed, yes, but it was fragile, easily overshadowed by the harsh realities of survival. The world was built on hierarchies where power flowed downward, crushing those at the bottom, and almost no one questioned whether it could be otherwise. Even within families, cruelty could be silent and insidious. Fathers held absolute authority over their households. A newborn child could be accepted into the family or exposed to die on a hillside, depending on the father's decision. Daughters were married off in their early teens to men twice their age, stripped of childhood and forced into lives of obedience. Sons grew up knowing they would soon be thrust into war, their youth consumed by drills and violence. Love was present, but it was always undercut by duty, expectation, and the looming threat of loss. The warmth of family was constantly shadowed by the cold logic of survival. Cruelty extended into education as well. Boys in Sparta, taken from their homes at the age of 7, were subjected to the agog, a brutal system designed to strip them of weakness. They were beaten, starved, and humiliated, encouraged to steal food but punished harshly if caught. The goal was to harden them into warriors who could endure unimaginable pain, to turn them into weapons of the state. Success meant glory. Failure meant disgrace. For those boys, childhood was not laughter and games, but training for death. Even in Athens, where education focused more on philosophy and rhetoric, the expectation of military service was unavoidable. The message was clear: your life did not belong to you, it belonged to the city. The cruelty of slavery was ever present, a reminder of how fragile freedom truly was. Slaves toiled in mines so dark and narrow that men often died without ever seeing sunlight again. Others labored on farms, their backs bent under relentless work, their bodies whipped for the smallest error. Women enslaved in homes lived with the constant threat of sexual exploitation, their dignity stripped away along with their freedom. Some slaves were branded like cattle, their skins scarred with marks that declared their status forever. These were not exceptions. They were the foundation of Greek society. The brilliance of philosophy, art, and politics rested on the broken backs of those whose suffering was ignored. Public cruelty, too, was normalized. To see someone flogged in the marketplace or dragged through the streets was not shocking, but ordinary. Justice was not only about fairness, but about making an example, and examples were meant to be painful. Crowds watched with fascination, children learning early that power expressed itself through domination. The suffering of others became a lesson taught by fire, blood, and humiliation. Even religion demanded spectacles of pain, sacrifices, rituals, and ordeals that reminded everyone that the gods required suffering to maintain balance. The culture of honor deepened this cycle. Reputation was everything, and insults could not be ignored. Feuds spiraled into violence, neighbors turning against one another, families destroyed by grudges, a careless word in the agora, a dispute over land. Even the outcome of a game could escalate into brutal confrontations. To live in this world meant carrying your pride like a shield, ready to defend it with fists or blades at the slightest provocation. And when violence erupted, it was not just the individuals who suffered, but their families, their communities, their legacies. Perhaps the cruelest truth was how normalized it all felt to the Greeks themselves. What would horrify you was, for them, simply life. They did not question the enslavement of others, the exposure of infants, or the beating of children. These things were part of the natural order, unchallenged, unquestioned, and accepted as the way the gods intended. Cruelty was not hidden in shadows, but displayed openly, shaping every life from birth to death. It was the background noise of existence, humming beneath the festivals, the debates, and the glories of marble temples. For a modern person, to endure this would be unbearable. The lack of safety, the constant exposure to violence, the absence of compassion as a societal value, it would erode your spirit day by day. You would crave kindness, but find it scarce. Seek fairness, but find only power. Hope for justice, but find only punishment. And yet, somehow the Greeks lived through it, thrived in it, even celebrated it. Their resilience was extraordinary, but it came at a cost measured in suffering, silence, and fear. And this is the final blow to the romantic image of Greece as a golden age of beauty and wisdom. Yes, there were philosophers questioning the cosmos, sculptors carving perfection into marble, and playwrights giving voice to the deepest truths of the human condition. But these achievements existed alongside a daily reality of cruelty so normalized that it would break the spirit of anyone accustomed to modern life. To step into that world would not be to step into glory, but into a cage where survival meant accepting pain as natural and where even the divine offered no escape. For if the gods themselves were merciless, how could men be any different?